A nurse at Blackpool Victoria Hospital is being found guilty of drugging patients. Catherine Hudson gave unprescribed sedatives to 2 people in her care for an easy life.
WhatsApp messages where she said things like, "I sedated one of them to within an inch of her life."
A second nurse, Charlotte Wilmot, here on the left, was also convicted of encouraging Hudson to drug a patient and conspiring to.
This is about what happened when a small group of healthcare workers stopped caring.
Hearing how they've spoken about patients who are people is absolute pure evil.
These defendants exploited them for an easy shift, for amusement, to exercise a contemptuous power over them.
Stroke patients mocked in expletive-filled messages.
To talk about the patients in such a demeaning way paints a picture of staff who basically would take the money and run.
Some patients drugged with powerful sedatives to keep them quiet.
You have to be especially careful in that patient group as to whether you prescribe something like Zopiclone.
And a huge police investigation. In 2018, a small group of nurses and healthcare assistants in Blackpool's main stroke unit were sending messages back and forth about stealing hospital drugs to either take themselves or use on patients.
"I'll see how I get on. If not, then you can rob me some tomorrow."
"Let me know and I'll get you some. If you aren't asleep by midnight, then you need to call up. I'll get what you need."
"Thank you, my secret drug dealer now."
Their job was compassion, but the phone messages were filled with contempt for the vulnerable people who relied on them.
"I'm going to kill bed 5.
PMSL. Well, tonight, sedate him to high heaven.
Already in my head to give him double."
Blackpool's one of the country's biggest holiday resorts. It attracts nearly 20 million visitors a year. And Blackpool Victoria Hospital's right at the heart of it.
It has one hospital, one major hospital. It is their lifelong hospital and always will be.
The hospital serves the whole of Blackpool and the surrounding coastline.
A huge amount of the patients are elderly. They come to live in this area, they come to retire in this area, particularly in the fringe towns like Lytham, St Anne's, Thornton, Cleveland. And they add up to a high percentage of the patients who use Blackpool Victoria Hospital, more commonly called the Vic.
The resort's also a particular favourite with older visitors. In October 2018, 71-year-old Aileen Scott was there for a short break with her son Brian.
Well, I was supposed to go to Mallorca with my brother and his family, but due to having a small bleed, she was unable to travel, and it was decided we'd go down to Blackpool.
Aileen was enjoying retirement. When Brian was growing up, she'd been an auditor in the Glasgow shipyards, a man's world where she'd had to hold her own.
She's a small, very petite woman, 5'2", was often known as the Rottweiler, but she always, she loved life. Big character.
You're obviously very proud of her.
Yes, she's a wonderful mum. Very, very fortunate, and we had a great time growing up. Many laughs, full of fun. Couldn't have asked for a better mum. The illuminations were on, the heritage trams were on. There was lots of things happening. It was a nice time to be there. We had a really nice dinner. We had a nice evening. We woke up the next morning to go for breakfast, and unfortunately, the next minute, my mum collapsed to the ground, and she took a massive subarachnoid hemorrhage, so a hemorrhagic stroke. Emergency paramedics, doctors arrived, I must say within seconds, and she was rushed into Blackpool Victoria Hospital. There was a real chance that she might not survive, so at that point, you feel like your whole world's crashing in on you.
Thankfully, Aileen did survive, but she was now completely paralysed down one side.
She did seem quite bright spirits and positive, but I discovered that they'd put a do not resuscitate on. I'd been told they wouldn't resuscitate her.
A do not attempt resuscitation order, or DNAR, means that if the patient's heart or breathing stops, the healthcare team won't try to start it again and they'll be allowed to die. 10 days after Aileen arrived, a student nurse was on night duty in the stroke unit when she got into a conversation with a senior nurse, Catherine Hudson. Hudson asked her how Aileen had been over the past few nights, and she said she'd been very restless. The court later heard that Catherine Hudson had suggested to the student nurse that Aileen should be given some Zopiclone, a powerful sedative. When she said that she couldn't because it hadn't been prescribed, she said that Hudson told her, well, she's got a DNAR in place, so she wouldn't be opened up if she died or if it came to any harm.
Zopiclone's a Schedule 4 controlled drug. It's a very strong type of sleeping tablet. It's not something that we'd want to routinely prescribe. It's something that should be under constant review. It's possible that you can feel a bit dizzy or lightheaded. It can affect your balance. And again, this is something we very much take into account with elderly people who are at risk of falls. You have to be especially careful in that patient group as to whether you prescribe something like Zopiclone.
The student nurse also thought she saw Hudson put a pot on the table with something which looked like a Zopiclone tablet in it. She went to the hospital authorities, who went to the police.
That's when the story began to bubble, as we would call it.
David Graham spent most of his life in Blackpool as a freelance investigative journalist, working for local and national newspapers.
I knew that some police officers based in Blackpool, some of whom had recently retired, had been switched on to a major inquiry involving the hospital, and they'd been asked whether or not would they be able to work for at least a year. And that was the first inkling that something out of the ordinary was happening. Followed up fairly quickly by learning that the local coroner had been asked to look back at certain deaths which occurred on the stroke ward.
By now, Aileen had been transferred to Glasgow Royal Infirmary, where she was progressing well. And then Brian got a phone call.
It was actually late in the evening. They introduced themselves as detectives from Lancashire Police, and they said, OK, we are on our way and we're heading to the Royal Infirmary. I was taken into a room and two detectives said an allegation had been made, whistleblowing about my mum's treatment and care, and they needed to start investigating that.
The detectives told Brian and Aileen that they were opening an investigation into her care in Blackpool.
You know, you think, how's this happening? You know, she was in hospital.
A member of staff at Blackpool Victoria Hospital has been arrested on suspicion of poisoning patients in the stroke unit.
The first I saw it was on the breaking news, nurse arrested at Blackpool Victoria stroke ward.
Well, police stressed that investigations are still in their very early stages, but here's what we know so far. On November the 8th, they were contacted by Blackpool Victoria Hospital after concerns were raised about the care of some patients in the stroke unit. In Lytham, next door to Blackpool, Julie Whitfield was trying to make sense of what she was seeing.
And the nurse was arrested in November 2018, which was 12 months to the day since David was discharged, but it mentioned the nurse had been an employee at the hospital for 4 years.
A year earlier, Julie's partner David had ended up in the unit after a massive stroke.
He was more or less in a coma, his eyes were closed. The hospital staff told me it was highly unlikely he was going to survive. It was a very poor prognosis.
David had been a big character. He ran the resort's Doctor Who museum and was a super fan of the series.
Travel through the universe on all the different levels, where we'll see the different levels of evolution, from the faceless monsters with no sense and no emotions, the Daleks.
He's a very colourful character, very flamboyant, very outgoing. Everybody knew David locally. He used to drive the Doctor Who car in the Lytham Carnival.
He sounds like he was a lot of fun to be around.
Oh gosh, yeah, never a dull moment with David. We packed an awful lot into the time we had.
By the time he entered the stroke unit, David was unable to walk or talk and had to be fed through a tube. He was completely dependent on the staff.
You were quite unhappy with the environment on the ward, weren't you?
Yeah, it was just, you could cut the atmosphere with a knife sometimes. It was weird. He'd been on other wards in the hospital, in the cardiac unit, and it was a lovely atmosphere, but there, You sort of ask questions, you felt you were a nuisance. I'd ask how David was doing, and the staff would maybe pull a face if he'd been particularly troublesome during the night.
David's right hand had been put in a safety mitten. They're sometimes used to stop confused patients pulling out their feeding tube, but only if there's no alternative.
One night when I went in, it was velcroed to the bars of his bed, almost like a prisoner tethered to a bed.
So his hand was attached to his bed?
Yeah.
And what did you think when you saw that?
Gobsmacked.
And then there was the Zopiclone.
The nurses did mention it in passing and they said he needed it. Then there's one night I actually went to visit him and his bedside locker was unlocked and all his medication was in, including the Zopiclone.
But Zopiclone shouldn't be given to patients with a feeding tube.
What's come to light with Zopiclone is sometimes crushing it can cause the liquid contents of the tube to thicken, and that thickening means the tube can get blocked. You might not be able to get nutrition to that patient, it's going to stop you administering other drugs, so that's obviously a big issue.
The first thing I did was I rang the helpline at the hospital and they're a bit vague. They wouldn't confirm or deny whether the arrested nurse had been on the ward at all when David was a patient. The police phoned me a couple of times. They asked me what my concerns were and they took his medical notes away for investigation.
The hospital trust says they can't comment on Julie's experience as they weren't made aware of it at the time, and they would always encourage patients and families to raise concerns with them. The police decided not to pursue a criminal investigation into David's care, and it wasn't a part of the eventual case.
In spite of everything, he had an absolutely wonderful last 2 years of his life. He went into a care home, nursing care home, where he got 24/7 support, and he was a different person within days.
By now, Lancashire Police were running a major operation, codenamed Bermuda.
4 people have been arrested, 3 women and 1 man, all said to be healthcare workers. They've been arrested on a suspicion of administering any poison or noxious thing with intent to injure and ill treatment or willful neglect.
During a period of 6 months, there were 7 arrests of healthcare professionals from the hospital.
It was a bombshell when it was finally realised how wide the scope of the inquiry was. People were, they were genuinely shocked. People you talk to, the conversation would go, oh, I had a relative in there. When was she in? When was he in? And people were beginning to think, oh, could it have happened to Uncle John or Auntie Frida or whatever?
The police started to look at records of deaths on the unit, including those after the start of the investigation, and at that point they made a terrible discovery.
We've got some news just coming in now. Lancashire Police have just told us that they're investigating the death of a woman who died at the stroke unit at Blackpool Victoria Hospital. It follows allegations of mistreatment made in November.
Valerie Neal had been a patient there in November 2018. Before her stroke, she'd been a fit, youthful 75-year-old at the centre of a close family.
She was fun, she loved people, she enjoyed life.
Valerie had been recovering, but then she had another stroke and died. When the post-mortem looked at why, they were stunned at what they found.
Police say that a woman who died in Blackpool Victoria Hospital's stroke unit 4 years ago was subjected to a horrific attack. 75-year-old Valerie Neal died from a hemorrhage caused by a non-medical related internal injury.
Well, it was out of the blue, totally out of the blue. It is beyond belief that you die from an appalling attack by a third party in a place which is supposed to be looking after you morning, noon and night.
The police immediately launched a new murder investigation. There has never been any suggestion that Valerie Neal's death is linked to any of the health workers arrested in the original drugs inquiry. Police have always stressed that the 2 investigations are entirely separate, but now there was a killer to find.
We're left with a huge wound that can't even begin to heal until we find out who's responsible for doing that. And so that we can get justice.
So for anybody that's watching at home this morning, how can they help? What information do you need today?
Well, I'm asking anyone, whether you were working perhaps or visiting Blackpool Victoria Hospital in November 2018, just to think back.
In March 2023, the police appealed for help on national television.
If you are uncomfortable contacting the police, then you can contact the independent charity that is Crime Stoppers. They've offered a £20,000 reward for information that leads to a conviction.
The hospital trust says their thoughts are firmly with Valerie Neal's family and they remain committed to discovering the truth about how she died. But still, no one has been charged in relation to her death and her family are still no closer to finding out who was responsible. Back on Operation Bermuda, looking at the potential drugging of patients, the police had started going through the mobile phones of the arrested staff members from the stroke unit, looking at the messages.
I sedated one of them to within an inch of her life, lol lol. Bet she's flat for a week, haha.
To talk about the patients in such a demeaning way, an uncaring way, paints a picture of staff who basically take the money and run.
What's Bed 29 been doing today? PMSFL. Not a f***ing lot, I bet. Seeing as I sedated her on Saturday and Sunday, lol lol.
Yay, I knew it. Everything you gave her has started working today.
Absolutely disgusting. The way that we're speaking about patients, they portrayed it was just banter, it was just a joke, it was humour. That's not humour. They're there to help, look after and care for patients, not behave the way that they did.
Right next tonight, 5 healthcare workers from the Blackpool Victoria Hospital appeared in court today following a major investigation into the alleged ill treatment of some patients on the stroke unit there. Our health correspondent Jill Dummigan was at Blackpool Magistrates Court.
The 3 nurses and 2 healthcare workers from Blackpool Victoria Hospital all face a variety of charges relating to the unlawful sedation of patients, conspiracies to ill-treat, as well as the theft and supply of medication.
When they congregated together, it was quite clear that Catherine Hudson was the mother hen figure. I had quite an involvement with the stroke ward because quite a close relative of mine was a patient in 2018 on that ward. So more than a journalistic interest, there was a personal interest in what on earth was going on.
You met Catherine Hudson, didn't you?
Yep, several times.
What did you think of her?
She ruled the roost in that unit. One got the impression that the stroke unit was Catherine Hudson's unit.
Of the 5 health workers charged, 4 denied those charges and 1 failed to enter a plea. But before the Crown Court case, 3 admitted stealing or conspiring to steal drugs from the hospital. That left 2, nurse Catherine Hudson and healthcare assistant Charlotte Wilmot, who went to trial at Preston Crown Court. Catherine Hudson, who hopefully you can see here, blonde bun and a black blouse, and Charlotte Wilmot next to her, were both nurses on that unit. The prosecution claims that certain patients were being doped up, in particular with a sedative called Zopiclone. They say the prescription drug restrictions on the unit were so lax that it was essentially a free-for-all. The defendants treated it as a sort of informal dispensary.
It was help yourself. Drug supermarket, what do you want? That ward seemed to get whatever drug they required, in whatever amount they required, whenever they required it, without any paper trail leading to the individual patient who was supposed to be using it. It was like a free-for-all.
Catherine Hudson told her trial that she'd seen colleagues drinking liquid morphine at work and admitted taking drugs herself. But she denies giving any unprescribed medication to patients at the hospital between 2017 and 2018.
It was almost like they prepared and rehearsed coming to court. It was as if it was a day out, the way that they dressed, they conducted themselves throughout. There was no remorse. They believed that they had done no wrong.
But the police had a trump card.
It's almost like a hidden, a little inside rule, you know, that we all have.
They'd set up a covert device to listen to Catherine Hudson in her own home.
You stick together, whatever you do. It's just taken to the grave. We say that all the time. We take that to the grave, take that to the grave. This stupid student nurse has spoilt that.
It was their big secret. It was something they could hide together, only they knew about. In the end, it was the most important evidence.
The Blackpool nurse found guilty of drugging patients for an easy life.
A second nurse, Charlotte Wilmot, here on the left, was also convicted of encouraging Hudson to drug a patient and conspiring to.
I could have screamed and jumped and clapped, but of course you're in a courtroom, you can't, but I was so pleased with the outcome.
Hudson's offending only came to light because a student nurse blew the whistle on what she witnessed when she was put on a work placement on the stroke unit.
She is to be commended for those actions. It's only as a result of her courage and clear sense of public duty that what was happening on the ward was exposed and stopped.
All of this came about because of her, because she went to the hospital.
Yeah.
She was very brave, wasn't she?
Absolutely. And I can't thank her enough. Can't thank her enough, because without her, I don't think this would ever have came to light. Through her brave actions and going to speak and raise it, whistleblowing, she did the right thing.
So you're going to court today to give your
Yes.
victim impact statement?
Yeah, this afternoon. So I'm doing that on behalf of my mum, really, to make Cathy Hudson, Charlotte Wilmot and all those that were involved really understand the impact that this has had on my mum. I want them to hear the damage they've done, not just to my mum, but to myself, to other family members, and to the hospital and nursing profession as a whole as well. Nasty, evil, self-centred, don't care about anybody but themselves. Words don't describe, do you know, what really, they're just awful, awful people. And as I say, these were vulnerable people that they were doing this to. It's just horrific.
Charlotte Wilmot walked into court with her face covered. Catherine Hudson was already in custody.
These offences of ill treatment were committed by these defendants whose duty was to protect and care for them. The patients were as vulnerable as anyone could be. They couldn't leave the stroke unit. Some of them found it difficult to make themselves understood. These defendants exploited them for an easy shift, for amusement, to exercise a contemptuous power over them.
Catherine Hudson was jailed for 7 years and 2 months. Charlotte Wilmot for 3 years.
And the defendants may go down.
I am delighted with the sentences that all have received. Whilst this will never bring full closure to us, it has helped to see justice being delivered. For the time my mum's got left, I hope to be able, this will help my mum, and it will help to bring some closure for her as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Chief Executive of Blackpool Teaching Hospitals NHS Trust says the case has been shocking and deeply upsetting for everyone, and that she was sorry people suffered from the actions of Hudson and Wilmot. She added that the Trust employs thousands of colleagues who are caring and compassionate in their work each and every day. She paid tribute to the bravery of the student nurse who brought their behaviour to the Trust's attention and said they'd quickly shared those concerns with the police. Lancashire Police continue the hunt for the killer of Valerie Neal, but that's not all.
The police investigation into the neglect of stroke patients at Blackpool Victoria Hospital is now examining 8 deaths. Blackpool Coroner's Office has been asked to review the deaths, which all happened in late 2018.
There has not been any suggestion that these deaths are linked to Catherine Hudson, Charlotte Wilmot or any of the convicted healthcare workers or the inquiry into the murder of Valerie Neal. The inquests were originally set down for autumn 2021 but have been delayed by the criminal inquiry. Families have now been told it will be autumn 2024.
It'll be 6 years after the death.
6 years after they thought their relatives had died in natural circumstances.
The Hospital Trust says it continues to support the inquest process to reach a conclusion for those people and their families.